is from a family member of mine. I won't say who or where they live, but this is a person who I love very much and is dealing with prescription drug abuse. And they wrote this on Facebook recently, and I want to just read a little piece of it and get your reaction to it. I worked my behind, we'll say, off harder than I've ever worked for anything else or anyone else. The lives of my wife and kids were background noises that my obsession ignored. I isolated myself from my friends, only seeing them or contacting them when I believed I could manipulate them into my service. So I want that person to know I love them very much. First, I just want to say that as well. But does that resonate with the folks that you guys help?
Sure. I mean, that's the story that we hear, all of us hear all the time. The addiction gradually takes over your life. It becomes the most important thing to you. Everything else falls by the wayside. And the person who's going through it hardly understands what's happening to themselves until they get to a point where they don't know which end is up. And hopefully that happens before they die and they can get some help, get some treatment. And, you know, I'm living proof that recovery is possible. I've been sober for 33 years. And so my drug of choice was alcohol, but I could have written that same thing.
And these prescription drugs don't stop?
No, they don't.
Necessarily with that?
No, I could have written the same thing. I don't have as much clean time as Dan, but I'm recovering from heroin addiction, and I could have written that too. Once you cross the line from abuse into addiction, your willpower is gone on opiates. And just the need to keep going drive you to isolation, to manipulation, to doing all the things that are written down there. It's a disease that takes control of your entire body and soul.
You know, I think that it's often stated within the programs of recovery or support groups, and what it's stated is that I ended up in places I said I'd never go, doing things I said I'd never do with people I said I'd never do them with. And the reality of it is that is a pretty common statement between people in recovery, because when this begins, no one considers what's going to happen, or they will use denial and state to themselves, this won't happen to me. And inevitably, if anybody knew the consequences of doing it, nobody would begin. None of us would have ever started engaging in some fun, some looking for experimentation, looking for another way to feel if we knew what the consequences were. And
prescription drugs are different than street drugs in that, you know, the perception is that it's from a doctor, it's safe, it's controlled. And so people just, as CJ said, they don't see that happening to themselves. You know, I'm stronger than that, I'm smarter than that, won't happen to me. This is something that happens to other people, but in fact, it can happen to you, it can happen to your loved ones, it can happen to your kids. So we're all susceptible potentially. So the more people understand that and don't think that this is something that happens to the other guy or the people down the street, the better off we all are in terms of having a social approach to a problem that's becoming all too universal.
So where are we with this prescription drug problem, and where is it often leading? I think we have a stat, and someone mentioned it earlier, like half of all young people who injected heroin surveyed reported abusing prescription opioids before starting heroin.
I would say the number is higher than half.
I would agree.
Most of the heroin addicts that I work with, including myself from my experience, prescription painkillers led to my heroin addiction. There comes a point in time when your tolerance gets so high that the painkillers don't do it anymore, and it's becoming too expensive. So you switch to heroin.
Heroin's cheaper than the prescription
drug?
In the
beginning. Okay. In the beginning, heroin will be cheaper. In the end, it'll cost you everything. And also with prescription drugs, because as Dan said, you know, the perception is wrong, because we see all these deaths, and we're hearing about this from heroin, opiates, #1 leading cause of accidental death in America. Most of those, a lot of them are heroin, but a lot of those are contributed to prescription drugs. So the perception is wrong. They're not as safe just because a doctor writes your prescription. Any opiate will kill you, and any opiate can turn you into an addict.
You know, and we've seen something happen when this new class of painkillers came on in the early 90s. They were ostensibly going to be used for very serious pain issues for people, for instance, that had cancer, that were terminal. But it evolved over a few-year period where the doctors were, you know, writing prescriptions with this stuff for everybody for any kind of pain, and that's what's happened. And so now we've got a situation where there's just tons and tons of these medications out there in the medicine cabinets, as your previous guest mentioned. People have access to them. They divert them. They're sold on the street. And kids are using them to get high. One thing that wasn't mentioned earlier is these drugs, as effective as they are in dealing with pain, they also make you feel really good because they're an opiate. And opiates are highly addictive, and it gets a grip on somebody really quick, Casey. And once it gets a grip in them, it changes, everything changes, and that's why they would become willing to switch to a drug like heroin, whereas prior they probably would have never considered doing something like that.
Once you get to the point when you're going through withdrawals from pain pills, the decision to switch from prescription opiates to heroin isn't even a cognitive thought. You just do it because your brain has basically been rewired by the drugs that it needs that to function. So you just keep going down this downward path of destruction and addiction.
And I think the reason for that is the way that it impacts the human brain. So what we're talking about is it impacts the pleasure-reward pathway inside the brain. And so what happens is that a person begins to use these. It could be for a legitimate pain reason. It could be a person's experimenting. But once that, for Chad's term, gets rewired, the purpose of use becomes avoidance of withdrawal symptoms. And so that's when you'll see an awful lot of people that will overdose. It really happens in three spots as it relates to heroin. One will be of a period of short abstinence, use the same amount, getting under the influence in a place that's unfamiliar to them, or a place where the drug that they get, the purity is unknown. So those are kind of three of the ways that folks overdose on heroin. But it's opiates and heroin act the same way in the brain as it relates to the pleasure-reward pathway.
What should the I don't want to say the rest of us because I think we've kind of established it affects a lot more people than we realize. But what those who maybe not be struggling with this particular problem, what should we be doing?
Well, one thing I think that we have to do is we have to have a couple things. One is docs have got to take a good hard look at how much of the stuff they're prescribing and back away from it. The other thing is we need it was mentioned earlier, a prescription drug monitoring program in the state of Missouri. We are the only state in the country that doesn't have this. And it makes sense to have it. And that every other state in the country has seen fit and seen the wisdom to do this, but we haven't, really is attributable to one senator on the western side of the state, Senator Rob Schaaf, who opposes it. In his mind, as a staunch libertarian, it somehow violates people's personal freedoms. So he's filibustered against it. And he was rather revealing in making the statement that these kids that are overdosing and dying are cleaning up the gene pool, which I think is a heinous statement. And I repeat it any chance I get because I want people to understand what we're up against with this one senator. He's a renegade, and we have to find a way to get this guy to stand down because this is something that would help. It's a database that physicians and pharmacists would have access to just for controlled substances. So that we can curtail doctor shopping, because this is where doctors are not at fault. People come in, they've become addicted, they're very good at manipulating doctors. They've got all kinds of stories, and they go from doctor to doctor. How's the doctor supposed to know that this guy was just at another doctor getting the same pills, you know?
One thing,
so, no, that's excellent foreshadowing. Again, we're going to go out.
One thing CJ and I were discussing is that one of the biggest messages we have to get to the people that aren't affected by this is not a criminal justice matter. This is a public health issue. Absolutely. It needs to be treated as such. This is a public health crisis. We have a lot of focus now, as we've spoken about harm reduction, to keep people alive, and also creating more pathways to treatment, which is going to change things and save people's lives. But the biggest thing we're facing now is stigma, and people looking at this as a crime matter when it's not.
Thank you, gentlemen.